The morning sun cast a pale light over the Pacific waters near the Solomon Islands, shimmering across the restless waves. The air was thick with salt and the hum of engines, a prelude to the chaos that would soon erupt above the sea. On the deck of the USS Essex, the scent of aviation fuel mingled with the faint metallic tang of machinery. Pilots adjusted their flight helmets, fingers brushing against worn leather straps, hearts hammering in anticipation. Somewhere in the distance, Japanese Zero fighters patrolled, confident in their speed and agility. They had faced American aircraft before and seen little reason to fear. But today, the U.S. Navy had a new weapon, something that would challenge everything they believed about air superiority. For months, whispers had traveled across the carriers and airfields, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. Its designers had promised power, durability, and the ability to turn the tide of aerial combat. But pilots, ever skeptical, were cautious. The Hellcat was bigger and heavier than the nimble Zero, and early observers say even among Allied forces had doubted it could compete with the legendary Japanese fighters that had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor. Yet, there was an unspoken confidence in the air. The Hellcat had been tested against every imaginable scenario, refined in the harshest conditions, and now it was ready for its first true trial against the enemy. The story of the Hellcat begins long before the first dogfight. In late 1941, the United States faced a critical problem. The Navy's frontline fighter, the F6F Wildcat, was outclassed in speed, maneuverability, and firepower by the Zero. Engineers at Grumman faced a monumental challenge: build a plane fast, tough, and deadly enough to survive against an enemy that seemed untouchable. The result was the F6F Hellcat, a combination of brute force and cunning design. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine roared with over 2,000 horsepower, a sound that promised dominance. Armored, fuel tanks, and self-sealing protection made it nearly impervious to the Zero's machine guns, and its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns could rip through enemy aircraft with terrifying efficiency. Despite its raw power, the Hellcat's designers had not sacrificed maneuverability. Test pilots discovered that with its wide wingspan and strengthened fuselage, the Hellcat could outturn a Zero in certain conditions, particularly in dives and high-speed engagements. This revelation would prove critical. The Japanese pilots, whose tactics relied on their aircraft's legendary agility, were unaware that their advantage was slipping away. They expected the familiar pattern: dive, evade, strike with precision. Instead, they were about to encounter a plane built to endure, to strike back harder, and to survive hits that would cripple lesser aircraft. By early 1943, the Hellcat had begun replacing Wildcats on carriers in the Pacific. Navy pilots who had flown the old Wildcats were initially wary. It felt like flying a battleship at first, one veteran later recalled. But once you got the feel, you realized it could dance, too. Training missions revealed something astonishing. New Hellcat pilots, many inexperienced, could take on seasoned Zero aces and live to tell the tale. This wasn't just an aircraft, it was a psychological weapon. Confidence, morale, and timing mattered as much as firepower, and the Hellcat instilled all three in pilots, who would soon face the crucible of combat. Meanwhile, Japanese forces monitored the growing presence of Hellcats with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Reports reached the command that American pilots were flying a clumsy new fighter. The Imperial Japanese Navy's pilots, many of whom had survived dogfights since 1940, laughed at the notion that this heavy American plane could pose a serious threat. They called it slow and ponderous, expecting an easy kill. But those reports underestimated the speed of American innovation. They didn't yet know the Hellcat had been engineered not just to match but to exploit the weaknesses of the Zero, with superior armor, speed in dives, and firepower that could decimate formations within minutes. The first real test came near the waters of the Solomon Islands. As dawn faded, carrier decks buzzed with activity. Pilots ran pre-flight checks, adjusted sighting scopes, and mentally rehearsed maneuvers. Each plane carried not just guns, the hope, the fragile kind, born in wartime, that a single mission could tip the balance. The ocean reflected an unsettling calm, a stark contrast to the storm of combat that waited in the skies. Aboard the carriers, flight officers briefed their pilots, emphasizing timing, altitude, and the tactical advantage of diving attacks. The stage was set. What neither side knew, yet would soon learn, was that the coming engagement would rewrite the rules of aerial combat in the Pacific. The Zeros, confident in their speed and agility, were about to confront a new breed of fighter, one that combined raw strength, tactical ingenuity, and a protective design that would challenge every expectation. The air was electric with anticipation. Engines revved, propellers blurred into motion, and the first American Hellcats prepared to launch. In those moments before takeoff, every pilot felt it, the quiet before a storm that would change the war above the Pacific forever. July 2, 1943, the Pacific sun had climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, turning the waves into glinting sheets of silver. From the decks of the USS Enterprise and USS Essex, the Hellcats roared into the sky, their engines vibrating with a power that seemed almost alive. Pilots gripped their controls with white-knuckled intensity, scanning the horizon for the unmistakable silhouette of the Japanese Zero. For many of these American aviators, this was more than a mission. It was a test of survival, skill, and courage. Some were barely out of training, their hands shaking as they adjusted throttle and flaps, yet each carried the weight of an entire carrier group on their shoulders. High above the sea, the first contact was made. A flight of Japanese Zeros spotted the incoming American fighters, and, as expected, they laughed. The seasoned pilots had seen Wildcats before. This new plane, they assumed, would be no different. But the first few moments shattered their assumption. The Hellcats dived with astonishing precision, gaining speed that the Zeros couldn't match. Machine guns opened up, the telltale staccato of .50 caliber rounds ripping through the sky. One after another, Zeros erupted in fire and smoke, their pilots struggling to maintain control as the Hellcats executed tactics designed to exploit their weaknesses. Witness accounts from both sides later described the surreal nature of the engagement. Japanese pilots wrote in diaries about the sudden ferocity of the American fighters, calling it unlike anything we had encountered. One veteran admitted, "We expected to dance with them, but the Hellcats struck like hammers, relentless and unstoppable." Meanwhile, American pilots reported how easy it was in some cases to outmaneuver planes they had once feared. The psychological impact was as potent as the physical. Confidence turned to fear, and hesitation in a dogfight is deadly. What made the Hellcat so effective was not only its firepower but its engineering brilliance. Its rugged construction meant that even when hit, the aircraft could absorb punishment and remain controllable. Pilots who were grazed by enemy fire described the uncanny feeling of being hit, and yet still able to pull up, dive, and counterattack. Its superior rate of climb allowed Hellcats to choose the terms of engagement, often diving to strike before the Zeros could react. The combination of speed and dives, powerful guns, and thick armor created a perfect storm, one that would soon earn the Hellcat a fearsome reputation across the Pacific. By mid-morning, carrier decks were filled with the smell of spent aviation fuel, and smoke trails marked the demise of dozens of Zeros. In one of the most remarkable confrontations over the Solomons, a single division of Hellcats, less than a dozen planes engaged more than twice their number in Zeros. Within minutes, several Japanese fighters were shot down, while the Americans suffered minimal losses. Tactical manuals later noted that the success of these engagements was not purely technical. It relied heavily on coordinated attacks, the disciplined use of altitude advantage, and the ability of the pilots to remain calm under fire. Amidst the chaos, individual acts of bravery and ingenuity stood out. Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, though earlier famous for his exploits in Wildcats, now flew the Hellcat with renewed confidence. His squadron leader recalled, "In those first fights, Butch seemed untouchable. He exploited every advantage the Hellcat offered, diving and rolling with precision that left the enemy scrambling." Stories like these spread quickly through the ranks, reinforcing the morale-boosting effect of a plane that could turn inexperienced aviators into lethal opponents. Yet the Japanese pilots were not easily defeated. Experienced aces attempted evasive maneuvers, trying to lure Hellcats into traps they had used successfully against Wildcats. Spirals, high-speed rolls, and tight formation tactics were deployed. But time and again, the Hellcat held its ground. The plane's structural integrity allowed it to withstand dives and sharp turns that would have crippled other fighters, and its firepower ensured that even a fleeting glimpse of an enemy plane could be fatal. Each encounter reinforced a grim truth for the Japanese. Their vaunted agility could no longer guarantee survival. By noon, the Pacific sky was a tableau of chaos and destruction. Smoke trails crisscrossed the blue expanse, punctuated by bursts of gunfire and explosions. Observers on nearby ships reported seeing multiple Zeros plummeting into the sea, their pilots lost in seconds. The American fighters, though heavily engaged, maintained cohesion, diving and climbing in orchestrated patterns that maximized their technological advantage. Amidst it all, the human element remained critical. Nerves of steel, split-second decisions, and the relentless drive to survive defined every maneuver. Interestingly, the Hellcat's success also reshaped Japanese tactics. Reports sent to the Imperial Navy Command expressed alarm. Pilots were advised to avoid head-on engagements and to rethink dive-and-zoom strategies. They began developing countermeasures, including new formations and coordinated attacks, but the momentum had shifted. The American focus on engineering superiority combined with rigorous pilot training meant that Hellcats continued to dominate the skies. Each engagement further proved that war in the air was no longer just about speed or maneuverability. It was about combining technology, tactics, and discipline into a system that could overwhelm even the most skilled opponents. As the afternoon sun began its descent, the battle over the Solomons slowed. Pilots returned to carriers, engines still hot, adrenaline coursing. The decks were filled with cheers and quiet reflection. For many, it was a moment of relief, but also of awe. The Hellcat had lived up to its promise, and then some. The day's engagement had demonstrated something crucial. Air superiority was no longer an abstract concept. It was tangible, measurable, and often decisive. And for the Japanese pilots who had underestimated this clumsy new fighter, the lesson had come at a high cost. Even after the battle, the stories continued to circulate. Memoirs, after-action reports, and interviews documented the psychological blow inflicted by the Hellcat. It was no longer just a plane. It had become a symbol of American ingenuity, resilience, and tactical evolution. And yet, for the pilot who flew it, the experience was intensely personal. The roar of the engine, the smell of the fuel, the tight tension of a dogfight, these were memories that would linger long after the war. The Hellcat had proven itself not only in steel and firepower but in the courage it inspired in those who trusted it with their lives. October 24, 1943. The sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Saratoga. A crisp wind carried the scent of salt and freshly poured aviation fuel, mixing with the faint metallic tang of machine oil and the lingering tension of anticipation. Pilots moved with a quiet urgency, checking instruments, tightening straps, and exchanging terse nods. Today, they would face a massive formation of Japanese Zeros 1F, the most concentrated enemy air attacks yet seen over the Solomons. The stakes were higher than ever. Lives, ships, and the fragile momentum of the Pacific campaign all rested on the shoulders of men flying machines of steel, fire, and ingenuity. As the Hellcats lifted into the sky, the roar of their engines merged with the cries of gulls and the distant thunder of artillery. Within moments, the first Zeros appeared on the horizon, glinting in the morning light, their pilots brimming with confidence and perhaps underestimating the power that awaited them. But this time, the Americans were ready in a way that could only come from months of trial, error, and adaptation. The formations were precise, almost surgical, with each Hellcat division assigned a tactical role: altitude intercept, diving attacks, and protective coverage for the slower dive bombers that followed. The first clash was sudden and brutal. Smoke trails instantly filled the sky as machine guns barked, the staccato fire punctuated by explosions that splashed water in great plumes far below. Japanese aces attempted maneuvers they had used successfully for years: tight rolls, high-speed climbs, and diving escapes. Yet the Hellcat countered effortlessly. Their heavy engines and robust airframes allowed them to dive faster and recover quicker than any Zero could anticipate. Pilots described the sensation of plummeting toward the enemy, guns spitting fire, as if gravity itself were an ally. Within minutes, several Zeros were engulfed in flames or trailing spirals of smoke, helpless against the ferocious, coordinated strikes of the Americans. On board the carriers, deck crews and commanders watched in awe. Radio chatter crackled with reports: 3 down in 30 seconds. Look at that, another one on fire. The scale of destruction was staggering. For every Hellcat, the odds had seemed daunting, yet the results were undeniable. The Japanese pilots had mocked this aircraft, calling it slow, clumsy, and inferior. And now, the very plane they dismissed had shredded their formations in minutes, demonstrating the lethal combination of engineering and tactical discipline. Among the Hellcat pilots, adrenaline surged. Each maneuver carried immense risk, every second demanding focus and precision. Lieutenant Commander Robert Johnson recalled later, "It wasn't just flying, it was a fight for your life, every split second. But with the Hellcat we had a chance. not just to survive but to win. For many, the most terrifying moments were not in the dogfights themselves, but in the knowledge that a single mistake could be fatal. Yet that tension was also a proving ground. Courage, skill, and trust in the machine coalesced into an almost instinctive rhythm of combat that turned panic into performance. As the engagement wore on, the Japanese formations began to fracture. Some pilots broke off entirely, attempting desperate maneuvers to escape the unrelenting pressure. Others were caught mid-turn by Hellcats diving from above, their heavy frames absorbing hits and maintaining fire. The psychological effect was undeniable. Confidence turned to hesitation, hesitation to fear, and fear to defeat. The Zeros had dominated the skies for years, but the Hellcat had rewritten the rules of the game in a matter of minutes. Even after the smoke cleared, the consequences were clear. The Hellcat had achieved air superiority in a way that no other plane had accomplished in the Pacific up to that point. Ships had been protected, pilots had survived seemingly impossible odds, and the Japanese forces were forced to rethink their strategy. Memoirs from both sides described the eerie quiet that followed, a momentary pause in the chaos, where men on both sides understood that the nature of aerial combat had fundamentally changed. The Hellcat was no longer just a tool. It had become a symbol of innovation, adaptation, and the relentless human drive to turn weakness into strength. Beyond the immediate tactical victories, the Hellcat's impact reshaped the trajectory of the Pacific War. By 1944, Japanese pilots who survived these early encounters carried a profound respect and fear for the aircraft they had once ridiculed. Imperial Navy tactics had to evolve, training manuals rewritten, and engagements reconsidered. Meanwhile, American morale soared. The stories of young pilots surviving overwhelming odds, aided by the Hellcat's engineering and firepower, circulated across the Navy. These narratives became almost legendary, feeding both the determination of future pilots and the growing legend of the plane itself. Yet, beneath the steel, smoke, and triumph, there was also reflection. For the men in the cockpit, each engagement was intensely personal. The Hellcat offered them a lifeline, but it also reminded them of the fragility of life. The smell of fuel, the jolt of anti-aircraft fire, the roar of engines, these were etched into memory. Reminders that survival depended on skill, courage, and trust. Today, historians and aviation enthusiasts look back at these battles and see more than tactics or numbers of kills. They see the intersection of human ingenuity, innovation, and sheer determination, a lesson that resonates even beyond the skies of the Pacific. By the time the sun set over the Solomon Islands, the battlefield had been forever altered. The F6F Hellcat had proven that preparation, design, and human courage could overcome even the most celebrated adversaries. It had turned mockery into awe, underestimation into triumph, and fear into respect. The story of the Hellcat is a reminder that progress in war, much like in life, often comes not from brute force alone, but from the combination of intellect, engineering, and the will to act decisively when it matters most. As we reflect on the Hellcat's legacy, it's clear that its influence extends beyond World War II. The lessons of innovation, resilience, and tactical thinking inform modern aviation, military strategy, and even our understanding of human potential under pressure. Those who flew the Hellcat carried more than a machine into combat. They carried hope, ingenuity, and the belief that skill and preparation could turn the tide in moments of peril. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Sometimes, the most formidable weapon is not just metal and firepower, but the courage to face what seems unbeatable and to prevail.